Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, with unwavering commitment to the cause of great conversation, your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran. Thank you all so very much for tuning in today. If, dear friend and listener and viewer, you find these conversations enlightening, entertaining, stimulating to the mind, or nourishing to the soul, please do consider subscribing to this humble little channel of mine. Like this episode, share it with a family member or a close friend, and join the conversation. So my guest today, with whom I'm very excited to have the opportunity to chat, is Jonathan White. John is a beloved professor at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, where he molds the minds of our young countrymen in the field of American studies. His areas of interest include the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, or to borrow an image from our 16th president, the golden apple and the silver frame by which that precious fruit's enclosed, slavery, antebellum, race relations, the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, and the history of treason in the United States of America. A senior fellow at the Center for American Studies, John was crowned last year's Gilder Learman Lincoln Prize winner alongside the famed biographer John Meacham. His essays have appeared in America's most recognizable newspapers and magazines, and he is the author of at least 16 books, most recently of Shipwrecked, of which I have and warmly encourage you all to get yourselves a copy, and a forthcoming children's book about which we will talk. John, I'm so thankful for the opportunity to chat today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the name Appleton Oaksmith brings to mind the image of a bearded, muscled, flannel-clad arborist somewhere out in the forests of Washington state, tending to his trees and the cultivation of their delicious fruit. But Appleton Oaksmith, lest you be misled by the name, was neither in the business of trees nor fruit. Who was he? What was his business, and why did you decide to write a book largely about him?
It's interesting. Probably about 8 years ago, I decided that I would write a history of the slave trade during the Civil War. And I had a list of men who I knew had been involved in the slave trade, mainly because they were writing to Abraham Lincoln seeking pardon. And one day I was sitting here in my office. It was during the summer, and I had a research assistant named Daniel Glenn. And I gave Daniel a list of these names, and I said, go into newspapers.com and see what you can find about them and come back and report to me. And one day he came into my office and he said, have you ever heard of Appleton Oaksmith? And I said, no. And I knew if I had heard of him before, I wouldn't have forgotten that name. I mean, it's a crazy, actually made up name, as we could talk about. And I asked him why, and he said, well, his name keeps coming up in all these newspaper articles that I'm finding when I'm searching for these other slave traders. And so he told me a little bit about what he had found, and I said, okay, keep looking and see what else you find. And then I started to do some digging of my own. And my initial thought was, I'll have a chapter on Appleton Oaksmith in this broader history of the slave trade. But the more I found, the more I realized that he deserved a book of his own. He was from a very prominent family in the Antebellum period. Both of his parents were writers. His mother was a very famous first-wave feminist. I'm convinced that if the story I tell in Shipwrecked hadn't happened, we would know who she is today, like we know Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, other famous women of that era. But at any rate, her son Appleton was involved in all sorts of different schemes during the 1850s. He went to California during the gold rush. He helped with the filibustering campaign in Nicaragua. He tried to fight for Cuban liberation. And then during the Civil War, he gets arrested for slave trading. And he has this just incredible story of arrest and trial and escape from prison that had never really been told before. And I, as my student began to uncover it, and then I began to dig deeper into the story, I just thought this is an incredible American story that people today should know.
If not for the nefarious trade in which he was engaged, I think he'd be heralded as one of these mythic American heroes today. Now, that was an excellent introduction to the hero or the anti-hero of your work. And there are a few components that I'd like to home in on. First, you mentioned Elizabeth Oaksmith, his renowned literary mother. She's, like you said, a lesser known feminist whose memory is eclipsed by the likes of Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Can you tell us a little bit more about her? You said that perhaps her lack of popular affinity amongst modern Americans is due in large part to the actions of her son. So maybe just flesh her out a little bit more for us.
Yeah, she was a very important writer in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. She wrote poetry, essays, journalistic reports, novels. She was dabbling in all different types of writing. And she was also an important feminist speaker. She would go out and give lectures around the country on behalf of women's rights. And she was very well known and pretty well liked, although she was lampooned by a number of her critics in the 1850s, and she received her fair share of criticism. She, as a young woman, well, actually, I mean, as a teenager, she got married when she was about 16 years old to a man who was in his 30s. And I believe that their marriage was happy at first, but over time she became very bitter about her marriage and how much older her husband was. And he had been a prominent journalist in the 1830s, but he sort of became something of a loafer towards the end of his life. And so she was also bitter that he wasn't supporting his family. And his name was Seba Smith. And at some point in the 1840s, she decided that she didn't want her boys to have the last name Smith. And so she had the state of New York legally change her kids' last names, where she basically smushed together her middle name, Oaks, and her married name, Smith, and created the name Oaksmith. And so all of her sons would have this made up last name, which is pretty interesting to think about, and also really facilitated my research, because anytime that I was searching for Oaksmith, it was either going to be Appleton or one of his brothers or one of their descendants. Now, when Appleton gets arrested in 1861 and he's charged with slave trading, he claims innocence. He claims innocence for his whole life. And his mother also fights to prove his innocence. And she begins a letter writing campaign to Abraham Lincoln and a lot of other prominent figures of the day. In fact, one of her letters to Abraham Lincoln is housed in his personal papers at the Library of Congress. And I think that's really important, because most of the letters that Lincoln received got farmed out to the federal bureaucracy, and they're now housed at the National Archives. But the letters that really meant something to Lincoln, he kept, and then they became the possession of his son, Robert, after Lincoln was killed. And then in the 20th century, they were donated to the Library of Congress. Clearly, Abraham Lincoln knew who Elizabeth Oaksmith was, and when he received her letter asking for pardon for her son, he kept it as something meaningful to him.
Yeah, you could maybe equate her to like a Maureen Dowd or a prominent female journalist in today's age, writing a letter on a pressing issue to President Biden or to President Trump or whomever it might be. So she wasn't an obscure figure at that time.
That's right. She was very well known. Her poetry was well loved. Edgar Allan Poe was a big fan of hers. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow had been a childhood friend of hers. Horace Greeley, the most important newspaper editor of the mid-19th century, actually allowed her to write on his pages, then allowed criticism to show up in the paper too, which she was very bitter about. But yeah, she was very well known in that time.
Yeah, and if you of course, explained their falling out, the Greeley and Oaksmith falling out. But yeah, she was kind of mingling in all the prominent salons in Northeast America, and had a really strong, powerful voice at that time when, feminism and abolitionism, kind of the two social movements of that age, were really underway. Let's deviate back to her son, Appleton Oaksmith. Now, of course, he was accused and convicted of slave trading. It's an accusation that he denied. Maybe we can focus a little bit on the broader picture of slave trading at that time in the 19th century. So while dangerous and, of course, iniquitous, it can't be said of the retail of human beings that it wasn't unlucrative, and thus it enticed a lot of people to venture it, to sail across the sea and to hazard these risks with the hope of reaping massive benefits in the form of profits on the
Right.
other end. So, after the prohibition of the importation of enslaved human beings to America in 1808, what did this look like for those who were endeavoring to do it unlawfully?
Yeah. So the slave trade is actually in the Constitution, not so much as it doesn't use the word slavery or slave trade, but it talks about the importation of human beings, essentially. And what the constitutional compromise was that Congress could not outlaw the slave trade for 20 years, but if they wanted to, they could. And so the summer of 1807, Congress passes a law abolishing the slave trade. Thomas Jefferson signs it, goes into effect in 1808. Most people in the United States, even if they were pro-slavery, could see how terrible the Middle Passage was, how evil it was. And so even if they were pro-slavery, they still supported abolishing the slave trade. But just because something's illegal doesn't mean that it goes away. People do illegal things all the time. Slave trade continued. And in 1820, Congress amends the law, passes a new law that declares that slave trading will now be piracy. So you'll be treated as a pirate. You'll be executed for your crime, according to the law. But again, people continue to participate in the slave trade. And the dirty little secret was that the federal government, which was dominated by either Southerners or Northern sympathizers with the South for most of the antebellum period, they turned a blind eye. And slave traders continued to participate in the slave trade, knowing full well that they would not be punished for their crime. They could bribe a jury, they could bribe a jailer to be able to escape. They just knew that they would never be punished. And nobody faced the full penalty of the crime until Abraham Lincoln became president in 1861. And finally, in February of 1862, he has someone executed for slave trading. But for that, 40, 50-year period, there's really no one who faces any serious punishment. In terms of who is participating, what may be very strange to modern people to hear is that it was often New Englanders. So the guy who gets executed in February of 1862 is a guy named Nathaniel Gordon. He was from Portland, Maine. Appleton Oaksmith, who gets convicted of outfitting ships for the slave trade, he was originally from Portland, Maine, and was living in New York City at the time of his arrest. And so it's not necessarily, there were some Southerners who were involved in the slave trade, but it's not necessarily Southerners. The last thing I'll say about it is that as the century progresses, it's not that there's many ships coming to the United States. There are American sailors and ships involved in the slave trade, but up until 1850, the majority are going to Brazil. And then after 1850, the majority are going to Cuba. There's a couple that come to couple of ships that come to the United States, but most are going to Brazil or to Cuba. Last thing I'll say about it, the British tried to destroy the transatlantic slave trade. And they negotiated treaties with the powers of the Atlantic world in South America and in Europe to be able to go onto those ships and their ships and search for evidence of slave trading and arrest people who were involved in the slave trade. The Americans, until Lincoln, the Americans refused to sign a treaty with the British that would allow them to search American ships. They remembered the experiences of 1798 and the War of 1812, where British sailors were going onto American ships and forcing them into the British Navy. They didn't want British sailors going onto American ships and searching for evidence of the slave trade. So up until 1862, the British they have an arm tied behind their back because they're not allowed to go on these American ships and find evidence of slave trading. And so the slave trade does persist under the American flag until the 1860s.
That was an erudite and compendious response, and it actually addressed a lot of the questions that I still have for you. So that was beautifully put. I want to focus in, though, just briefly on that piracy law of 1820. And your book talks about this and other things that really surprised me. 1820, I think, is perhaps best known as the year in which the Missouri Compromise was signed. And yet this other piece of legislation, the Piracy Law of 1820, in some ways is much more relevant to your story and I think undeservedly overlooked by history. So maybe you touched on it, but maybe you can expand on it a little bit more. You said that it mostly was not enforced in the years between its establishment and Abraham Lincoln's ascendancy to the presidency. Can you maybe flesh that out a little bit, that time period?
Sure. Yeah, 1820, you're right, is most famous for the Missouri Compromise. And that, of course, was a law that drew a line through the Louisiana Purchase. And it said, south of this line will be slave territory, north of this line will be free, except for the state of Missouri, came in as a slave state. And then to balance Missouri, they brought in Maine as a free state. And what the politicians of that era were trying to do was to try to have parity or balance between northern free state interests and southern slavery interests. And the slave trade law, I actually don't know the timing in terms of what was signed first. I don't know the dates off the top of my head. The Missouri Compromise, they began to debate a year or two earlier, and then it finally becomes law in 1820. But I think that this was a way that they're trying to kind of appeal to both interests. So they don't outlaw slavery. And in fact, in the Missouri Compromise, they allow it to expand. But at the same time, they recognize that while the slave trade feeds slavery, they recognize just how morally evil it is. And so a lot of Southerners are willing to support a law that outlaws the slave trade. But then at the same time, what's fascinating is that you then look at the subsequent decades, and it's not a massive slave trade coming into the United States, but there are ships that periodically come in, and everybody knows it, but they turn a blind eye. There's one case where a ship, I think the ship's name was the Wanderer, comes into Charleston, South Carolina, and the man who owns the ship gets arrested. And he goes to trial, but of course he's not convicted. And when he gets out, he goes and he buys back the very same ship that he had used for the slave trade in the 1850s. And nobody in Charleston cared. They were more than happy to allow this sort of thing to happen.
Yeah, so it wasn't a totally brazen maneuver to go right up into the port of Charleston and try to offload your cargo. But like you said, more common was it to go to Cuba, where things were a little more lax, and disembark your goods there. You mentioned the name Nathaniel Gordon, and I was struck by his story. Like you said, he was a Northerner, but it was under the Piracy Law of 1820 that he was arrested, convicted, and ultimately executed by the state. An example of capital punishment on the federal level. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about him and the ultimately unsuccessful effort to pardon him?
Yeah, so Gordon participated in at least 4 slave trading voyages in the 1850s. First mainly out of Brazil, and I think he had one out of Cuba later. It's August of 1860. He is in his ship, the Erie, on the west coast of Africa. He loads up the ship full of almost 900 people. Most of them are women and children. At least one is as young as 6 months old. I mean, he is going after the weakest of the weak. He does it in 45 minutes. He uses a bladed weapon of some sort to cut off the remnants of the clothes of the men and women as they're boarding his ship. And he uses that blade to separate the men and women as they go below deck. He then sets sail. And as he gets out onto the Atlantic Ocean, he sees a ship coming in the distance. And he knows it's a ship of one of the Africa squadrons. There's an American Africa squadron. There's a British Africa squadron. And remember, they're not allowed to search. Americans can't search British ships, and British can't search American ships. So Gordon sees the ship approaching, and he has to take a gamble. He has to decide, do I think it's an American ship or a British ship? If he thinks it's an American ship, he'll run up the flag of another nation. If he thinks it's a British ship, he'll run up the American flag. And he gambles, and he gambles wrong. He thinks it must be a British ship, so he runs up the American colors. And then he finds out it's the USS Mohican, and they run up the American flag. They overtake him, and they go below decks, and they find these, I think it's 897 Africans below deck. They go in, they rescue these people. They send them, sadly, they send them to Liberia, where many die along the way, and they are not given equal treatment in Liberia, which is a whole nother part of the story. But Gordon and his mates are then arrested. His mates are sent to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where they are tried and convicted, and then he is sent to New York City. When he gets to New York, James Buchanan, a Pennsylvania Democrat, is still president. And Buchanan's U.S. Marshal, the jailer, essentially, for a bribe of $50, allows Nathaniel Gordon to walk around New York City and have fancy dinners like a gentleman. Gordon never thought he was going to get convicted. And in fact, his first trial ended in a hung jury, most likely because his friends probably bribed some of the jurors. But then Lincoln...
Let me interrupt just very briefly. How was he received in America by the population at large?
That's a good question. You know, I think a lot of it would depend on party affiliation. So the the newspapers of that era were unabashedly partisan. Today, our media pretends like it's non-biased, but everyone knows if you're of one political persuasion or another, you watch a particular cable news station. In the 19th century, they were honest about it. So if you were a Republican, you got the New York Times, believe it or not, that was a Republican newspaper in the 1860s, or you got the New York Tribune. If you were a Democrat, you got the New York World or the New York Journal of Commerce. You got the paper of your party. So I think it would often depend, it would really depend on what party you were and what your newspapers then would say, towing the party line. So Gordon hung jury first trial, and then Lincoln's prosecutor and marshal decided to do things differently. So they move him to what would be considered a maximum security prison. It was a place called the Tombs. They sequester the jury for the second trial so that the jury can't be bribed. This time he's convicted. Now you might think this is a great moment in humanitarianism, that a guy who participates in one of the most horrible crimes in the history of the world is finally going to receive his just desserts. But thousands of people write to Abraham Lincoln asking for pardon. They say things like, well, no one's ever been punished for this before, and Nathaniel Gordon didn't see it coming, so it wouldn't be fair to punish him because he never thought he'd be found guilty. Some people in Portland, Maine write to Lincoln and say, you know, Gordon's got a really nice wife and a young child and a nice mother and some really nice friends. You should commute the sentence for that reason. Nathaniel Gordon's wife and mother actually go to the White House and try to meet with Lincoln. Lincoln at that point his two little boys are very ill. One of them is going to die before the month is out. And Lincoln just says, I can't meet with them. I can't deal with that right now. And so Lincoln refuses to meet with them. Lincoln ends up coming up with a solution. And it's very Lincoln-esque. He grants a 2-week stay of execution. In essence, he says, okay, Nathaniel Gordon didn't know he was going to be executed. I'll give him 2 weeks to think about it. I'll give him 2 weeks to think about what he was doing before he goes to meet his maker. And in Lincoln's words, he says, so that he can prepare for the awful change which awaits him. In other words, you're gonna come before God and have to account for what you've done. You better be ready with an answer. And then Lincoln closes that message by talking about the common God and Father of us all. In other words, these were human beings made in the image of God who deserved dignity and respect. And Nathaniel Gordon needed to reflect on what he was doing. Gordon, a friend snuck in some poison the night before the execution, and Gordon took the poison, and the guards heard him writhing in pain. They summon a doctor in the middle of the night. They go in, they pump his stomach, and the next day he is hanged. And it's the only time in American history that someone got the full punishment of the law.
Yeah, and it's a small segment of your book, but I was so struck by it. It's only a couple pages long, but you describe this incident, this trial, and Lincoln's response to it. You're absolutely right. It is so Lincoln-esque. It's such a boss move. Like you said, he gives him 2 weeks. Allows him to get his mind right before he meets his maker, and that's it. And like you said, it was a law that was implemented 4 decades prior to Lincoln's ascendancy to the office of president. So, he was, of course, unsympathetic to Gordon's case, but he was also just enforcing the law as it was laid down many years prior. Why do you think it was that so many of these Northerners, again, that's not to say they were necessarily unsympathetic to the cause of slavery, but why do you think it is that so many Northerners participated in the illegal trade?
As you mentioned before, it was very lucrative. If you brought a cargo of human beings across the Atlantic Ocean and lost half of the cargo, which was not uncommon. I mean, there was a lot of sickness and disease. People would be thrown overboard and just killed if they were seen as too weak to make the entire journey. If you just got part of your cargo across, you would make a fortune, and everyone involved would make money. The sailors, the mates, the captain, the investors. And so they did it for the money. There's no doubt about it. And then, the people who write to Lincoln seeking a commutation of the sentence, their view in a number of cases was, well, we've proven now that we can catch these guys. We caught Gordon, we convicted him. That should be enough to dissuade other people from doing it. But I don't think that would have been enough. I think Lincoln knew that wouldn't be enough. You had to actually show we are going to enforce this law, and that's going to be what stops it.
Yeah, until that level of deterrence was evident, people were just going to continue to break that law brazenly. Yeah. I wonder, was there any attempt by the British or the Americans to not only to stop the trade coming from west to east, so slavers coming from South America, Brazil, Cuba, and the Americas, but from east to west, maybe dealing with the African nations or the African tribesmen who were also conducting business of their fellow Africans? Do you know if there were any efforts to kind of stop?
That's a good question. I don't know. I imagine there were some reformers who tried to do that, because this was part of what's often called the triangular trade in earlier generations, where you've got things going from the United States to Europe, and then goods from Europe to Africa. They're being traded to Africans who have captured other Africans and then are trading them. I mean, Nathaniel Gordon purchased the 897 Africans with rum. That's right. I mean, that's why it's so profitable. You pay the Africans who have captured other Africans with rum, and then you bring those people to Cuba and you sell them for money. I mean, you're making a fortune. So I don't know to what extent that was being done, but there were these squadrons, these Africa squadrons run by the British and the Americans that would hover along the coast of West Africa, along the Congo River and so forth, trying to do what they could to stifle this slave trade. But with thousands of miles of coastline, it's a really hard job to do.
Yeah, and to their everlasting credit, they did their best to at least slow down what was an execrable trade. Can you maybe explain to us in a little greater detail how exactly they set about doing this? Of course, we know that the British had squadrons along that western coast of Africa, but as you mentioned, it's a treacherously long coastline. So how did they do this? Like, how many ships are we talking about here? And of course, you mentioned America's involvement, but it was sort of I don't want to say half-hearted involvement, but there was certainly some reservation amongst the American ships who were fearful of being boarded by the British and perhaps being subjected to impressment as they were just a couple decades prior.
Yeah,
the War of 1812.
I forget the number of ships off the top of my head. There was a treaty in 1842 called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, and in that treaty, the United States said, we're not going to allow you to search our ships, but we will commit to having a certain number of ships on the western coast of Africa, and the British committed to having a certain number of ships. I just forget what those numbers are. But it was a very monotonous duty. I mean, the people who did it, who were on that duty, were bored to tears, because they're just out there floating, with someone with a spyglass looking in various directions to try to find ships on the horizon. There's a collection of letters right across the street from where I am here at Christopher Newport University at a place called the Mariners Museum. Mariners Museum, for your viewers and listeners, if you ever make it to Newport News, it's an extraordinary museum. It's 100 years old. They've got artifacts from all of world history related to the maritime world and maritime commerce. And then they have the largest manuscript collection in the Western Hemisphere related to maritime activities. So they have a collection of letters by a guy named William McBlair, who was a Southerner, a white Southerner, who was part of this blockading duty on the west coast of Africa. And his letters are mainly about how boring it was. Just there was nothing to do. What's interesting about McBlair, again, he was a Southerner. He was pro-slavery. And then when the Civil War comes around, he becomes a Confederate sailor. And he's got two other very large collections of letters at other archival repositories that tell of his Confederate service. So it's a really interesting dynamic where you've got these people who are out there trying to catch slave traders, really tedious work, and then they go on to join the Confederacy a couple years later. You never would suspect that, but that sort of gives you a sense of who some of these sailors were.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary change in one's life to go from blockading the slave trade to actually fighting for the side that wants not necessarily its continuation, but the continuation of the institution of slavery. I wonder how that program was received by the public in both England and America, because, of course, to maintain a squadron or a fleet of ships off the coast of a distant continent is going to incur no small expense. So, it was not probably from an economic standpoint of people who are being taxed and not really seeing the reasons why, it was probably not welcomed. Do you know anything about the public sentiment about these expenditures that were going to some far off land?
It's a good question. I don't. It's the kind of thing, though, that's interesting. It would be really easy to find out today in the digitized world in which we live. You could go on newspapers.com and type in Africa Squadron, and you'd probably find some editorials or other reports where newspapers talk about what they think about it. It's hard to know. I would guess that because Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution allows for the creation of an army and navy and makes the president commander-in-chief, and allows, that's in Article 2, but then Article 1, Section 8 allows for Congress to make needful rules and regulations and pass treaties and so forth. I would guess that you wouldn't have a lot of constitutional objections to it. As far as an economic concern, I would also guess that it was a fairly minor line item in the appropriation bills.
Yeah.
Even though the appropriation bills were not that big back then compared to what they are now, I would guess that it was a fairly minor thing. It's not a lot of ships that are out there.
Yeah,
so it probably just didn't get a whole lot of notice. That would be my guess. But
maybe amongst the wonks there was a little bit of belly aching or cheerleading, but okay, so probably amongst the larger population it went largely unnoticed. What did not go unnoticed, though, was the suspension of habeas corpus and the detention of political prisoners during this period. Now, I don't think Nathaniel Gordon was necessarily a political prisoner, but you do mention some of them and that phenomenon in your book. I think just briefly you touched on Representative Vallandigham of Ohio. Can you, for our listeners and viewers, explain his story a little bit? Now, of course, he's not the main subject of your book, but I'm always engrossed by his life and what came of him. So maybe you can give us a little detail.
About 10 or 12 years ago, I wrote a book called Abraham Lincoln and Treason in the Civil War, and it tells the history of Lincoln's suspending habeas corpus. And what that essentially means is that Lincoln used the military to arrest people and hold them without charges for indefinite periods of time. And that's actually what Lincoln uses as a pretext for arresting Appleton Oaksmith. Clement Vallandigham was a politician from Ohio. He was a member of Congress. He was a very outspoken critic of the Lincoln administration. He was a Democrat. And in 1860, the Republicans won elections in Ohio. They redistricted, and they moved Vallandigham from a Democratic seat district to a Republican district. And when he ran for re-election in 1862, he lost. like most politicians, he didn't want to be out of the game. So his plan was, I'll go back to Ohio and I'll get elected governor. The problem he ran into was he was not the Democratic Party's first choice. And so he had to figure out a way to win the nomination. And the best way he thought of was to get himself arrested for giving quote unquote disloyal speeches. And so in April of 1863, he gives speeches where he blasts Abraham Lincoln as King Lincoln, who violates the First Amendment. And he gets himself arrested by a Union general named Ambrose Burnside. Now, Vallandigham believed he would be arrested and just held for a little while and then released, and then he'd be a martyr and the Democrats would make him their nominee for governor. Burnside had totally different plans. Burnside had Vallandigham thrown in prison, then sent on a train to Cincinnati and tried before a military tribunal, where he was found guilty and sentenced to hard labor for the duration of the war. And if you think about it, that's crazy that a congressman would get imprisoned for the duration of the war for speech, because you don't know how long the war is going to last. It could be another 6 months. It could be 6 years. Well, Lincoln finds out about this by reading about it in the newspapers. And so Lincoln thinks, this is not why I'm suspending habeas corpus. It's not to have congressmen thrown in prison. But Lincoln also doesn't want to undermine his general by releasing him. So Lincoln comes up with, again, another Lincolnian response. He thinks, well, if Vallandigham likes the South so much, why don't we just send him there? So he has Vallandigham sent to Tennessee, crosses over into Confederate lines. Well, the Confederates didn't want Vallandigham. And the truth is, Vallandigham didn't want to be in the South. He wanted to be governor of Ohio. So he escapes through the blockade, makes his way up to Canada, settles in Windsor, Canada, which is right across the Detroit River from Detroit. He wins the Democratic nomination for governor, then loses in a landslide in October of 1863. In 1864, Vallandigham slinks back into the United States, and Lincoln essentially says to his commanders, leave this guy alone. Don't arrest him again. Arresting him does more damage to us. If we just let him speak his disloyal language, he'll hurt his own side. And that's essentially what happens.
Oh my gosh, it's such a good story. A Man with No Country. I think a book or a film was.
Yeah, there was a short story written in 1863 by Edward Everett Hale called "The Man Without a Country," and it's a sort of parable about Clement Vallandigham. And that short story was turned into a propaganda film in 1917 during World War I about socialists in the United States who opposed World War I and then come around to see the evil of their ways and become patriotic. So it's a story that's had a long life. I teach it every year in my classes. And in fact, about 10 years ago, I taught A Man Without a Country as a short story in one of my classes.
I'm so glad that you continue to teach him and keep his name alive, because it's, I think, forgotten by most of us. I don't think I was taught about him in all of my education. So, of course, you touch on him. Now, I do have to ask, what is it true that he deliberately, kind of knowingly made these speeches, these unfavorable speeches, and got himself arrested? I didn't realize that was part of his shtick.
Yeah, I think it was all a strategy on his part. The backstory is that Ambrose Burnside was a disaster of a general where I am in Virginia. So Lincoln needed to get rid of him and thought, I'll just move him out to Ohio where there's, he can't cause too much trouble. And Burnside issued a general order called General Orders Number 38, where he essentially said anyone who speaks out against the Lincoln administration will get treated like a spy or a traitor. And Vallandigham then took that as, that's what I'm going to go out and critique. And to be very precise, Vallandigham never advocated violating the law, using violence against the U.S. government, anything like that. He essentially said, vote the bums out. If you don't like what Lincoln's doing, vote him out of office. But Burnside thought, well, that's disloyal. He should be arrested.
Yeah, so maybe a slight overreach, but one that Lincoln could condone at the time, with a lot of other things on his plate.
Yeah.
I want to turn.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, this is going on right before the Gettysburg campaign,
right,
and the Vicksburg campaign. So to your point about everything going on, it's like these generals were a huge thorn in Lincoln's side. He's trying to win a war, and you've got these major battle campaigns going on while the generals are kind of messing up with these minor issues on the home front.
Yeah. Maybe it's an example of the generals being able to handle the misdemeanor, but not the felony, right? So they're able to handle the small thing in Vallandigham, but not the larger campaign that was ultimately handled by another Ohioan who came in to save everyone.
Yeah.
I want to introduce a Spanish word, filibustero, although its etymological origin might be traced to the Dutch. Today we recognize filibustering as the rhetorical maneuver employed by garrulous lawmakers in order to delay the vote on a piece of legislation. What was filibustering in the original sense?
In the 1850s, there was a man named William Walker who wanted to establish a pro-slavery empire somewhere in Latin America. I believe he tried in Mexico at one point, but then the most famous instance of this was in Nicaragua, where it was known as filibustering, and I don't know the etymology of it in this sense of the word, but he was trying to set up an empire where he would be the president of a pro-slavery nation in Nicaragua, and he was successful to some extent, but eventually was ousted and executed. But one of his right-hand men was Appleton Oaksmith, who was up in New York City trying to raise money and support men to send to Nicaragua to help Walker in this scheme.
Yeah, and what was the filibuster? Like what was a filibuster? What was his end? What was his aim?
I actually don't even know how I would answer that. I haven't looked at the etymology of it to see. They were known as filibusterers. I don't know how the word came to change in meaning from that sense of it in the 1850s to today, when members of the Senate read out of the phone book to stall a vote on something. I'm not sure.
Well, you mentioned William Walker,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm fascinated by this figure. Exactly why did he go into Mexico and Nicaragua? What, to establish what exactly?
There were a lot of Americans who wanted to expand a slave empire into the South. So in the 1850s, there were a number of attempts to do this in Mexico. There were attempts to do it in Cuba. In fact, James Buchanan, before he became president, signed on to something called the Ostend Manifesto, where the federal government essentially said to Spain, either sell us Cuba at a certain price, or we're going to take it by force. And that fight on behalf of slaveholders in the United States to expand into South America, Latin America, continued during the Civil War and even into the post-war period. I don't write about this in the book, but during the Civil War, there were slaveholders who sent their slave property to Cuba as a way of trying to protect it. And then after the Civil War, there were Confederates who actually moved to Brazil and became known as Confederados, and they tried to set up their own sort of new confederacy within the borders of Brazil. Their descendants are still in Brazil today, and in fact, up until last year, celebrated what they called the Confederate Festival, where they would there's a cemetery of Confederate veterans in Brazil, and these Confederate descendants would go and celebrate their ancestry there. That festival finally kind of ended in the last year or so in the wake of what happened in Charlottesville and then George Floyd. People in Brazil began to say, we don't think you should be celebrating this anymore. But there's a long history that goes back to the antebellum period of Americans trying to spread slavery, because what they believed was if slavery didn't expand, that it would die out. And so that's why the fight in 1820 was so big over the Missouri Compromise. Northerners recognized if we can hem slavery in and stop it from spreading, it's going to die out. Most white Southerners, Jefferson is an exception, but most white Southerners believed if that happens, if you don't allow slavery to expand, it's going to die and we're going to lose all of our wealth. So they're trying to find ways to spread it to new land, be it Nicaragua, Mexico, Cuba, or elsewhere.
Yeah, so that celebration in Brazil just reminds me of the Shakespeare line from Hamlet: "A tradition more honored in the breach than the observance." It's probably better that it die
Yeah.
in this age, but it's still extraordinary to know that there was this dauntless and indefatigable effort to sort of expropriating land, within our hemisphere, and basically to colonize it and to stir up revolutions and to create a larger American empire that was more in favor of slavery.
And it's really interesting in light of the Monroe Doctrine,
Right.
because the Monroe Doctrine basically said to Europe, don't do this. Like,
This
leave
is
the
our
Western
backyard.
hemispheric nations to themselves. But then there were enough Americans who thought, well, but we could do it.
Right. I want to change directions in the few minutes that we have remaining to us. The first question I have for you is, do you ever become somewhat weary of or disenchanted with the main subject of your academic career, Abraham Lincoln?
No, I mean, the thing about, people often say to me, aren't there enough books about Lincoln? There's 16,000 books about Lincoln. Isn't that enough? Is there really anything new to say? And the truth is, there are new things to say. And part of it is, as new sources come to light, they shed new light on topics that we thought we knew well. So there have been a lot of books about slavery and the slave trade. No one had ever uncovered Appleton Oaksmith's story to the extent that I've now done it before. Or you mentioned I won the Lincoln Prize last year. That was for a book on Abraham Lincoln and African Americans. People knew that a couple of very famous Black people had visited Lincoln: Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, a couple others who were well known in their time. Using digital archives and databases like newspapers.com, I was able to find what I think are hundreds of African Americans who met Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and explain the significance of those meetings, how they changed Lincoln's views on certain public policies. And so I think as long as new sources are coming to light, there will always be new books to write. I will never write a biography of Lincoln. People often say to me, why don't you write a biography of Lincoln? And I have no interest in doing that, but I'm always interested in coming up with a story that no one's ever done before. One of the books I'm most proud of came out in 2017. It's called Midnight in America, and it's a history of dreams during the Civil War. I wanted to find, what did people dream about, and what does that tell us about their experiences? And I've got chapters on soldiers, civilians, men and women, slaves, and I have a chapter on Lincoln because he has some really famous stories about his dreams. And, in the 150 years that Americans had been writing about the Civil War up to that point, we'd ignored everything from sunset to sun up. And yet that's a third of the day. It's a third of the experiences of the people who lived through the Civil War. And so I think as long as we keep trying to be creative in the questions we ask, we can come up with new things to say about Lincoln and the Civil War, or any time period for that matter.
You mentioned the copious biographies that have been written about Abraham Lincoln. Does one stand out in your mind as especially brilliant and worthy of our reading if our listeners and viewers had to select just one?
Boy, that's a great question. And it's one I'm not going to answer, because if I pick one, then someone will say, well, why didn't you pick this other one? There are a lot of really good modern biographies of Lincoln. And so, a big part of answering that question would also then depend on what aspect of the Lincoln story is most interesting to a particular reader. So it's as straightforward as a question as it is, it's actually a pretty complicated one. And I'll just say, it's a tough one to narrow it down out of so many books.
So I'll just advise my listeners to purchase all of your books.
There you go. There you have it.
And through them, you'll have a somewhat
get a full picture of Lincoln,
panoramic view of the man. I will submit my selection, and it's kind of an uncelebrated one. It's a book by Lord Charnwood, who was a British historian, I think from the early 20th century. So it's not exactly modern. And it's curious to read a portrait of Lincoln by an Englishman. It's something that I've never experienced. So it seems to me that you've read that. If you've not,
I've actually not read Charnwood's. I know that
it's not
very highly regarded.
Yeah, for everyone listening, it's on my shelf. It's a rather thin book. I mean, you'll finish it in only a couple of days' time, maybe a week. So it's not this gargantuan kind of like Gordon Wood, massive tome. It's actually digestible, but it's just the prose is so elegantly written, and it's not so far away from Lincoln's life that it seems like it seems kind of a little bit more intimate, if that's a word that I can use to describe a biographical sketch. So I maybe I'll include a link to that. It probably is available on Amazon, but it's one of those.
It is. There are some modern, because the book is over 100 years old, so I know there's some reprinted editions of it. And if memory serves correct, I think there's a LibriVox edition of it too, which is a crowdsourced free audiobook program, which is hit or miss in terms of quality, because you just have people at home who are thinking, oh, I'm going to read a couple chapters out of this book. I think a year or two ago, I started listening to that one on LibriVox, and I don't know why I didn't finish it, but I think your listeners could get it that way too. For free.
If you could get a good edition read by the likes of Jeremy Irons, I would absolutely recommend it. That would be worth your listening. And in the very final minutes that we have remaining to us, I want to talk about your children's book that you've undertaken to write, and it's now available for pre-order. It's entitled My Day with Abe Lincoln. Of course, I will include a link to it in the show notes below. What was the motivation behind your writing this book?
I've got two girls. They are now 7 and 10. And for 10 years now, I've been telling bedtime stories, and usually making up stories about bunnies and mice and all sorts of crazy antics that animals would do. But I also have tried to get my kids interested in Lincoln and history, and we've gone to a lot of sites, and probably too many in their minds. And so about, 5 years ago, I had the idea to try to write something about Lincoln for kids and sort of bring these two areas of my life together, the dad part and the historian part. And the book really evolved. At first, I thought I'll do a story about Lincoln's childhood and education. And then I thought, well, there's already some books like that. And I thought I'll do a picture book. And so I wrote the text of a picture book. And then I thought, I don't know, those are really hard to sell, actually, to get someone to publish them. And so the story continued to evolve, and it became a chapter book, an early reader chapter book, really geared towards 6 to 10-year-olds. And what I do in the story is I have a 3rd grade girl who doesn't want to go to school one day, and she throws a tantrum and dresses in a really silly outfit. And then as part of her outfit, she puts on her brother's magic top hat, which you can see there. And that magic top hat transports her back into time to Indiana in the 1820s. And she meets Abe and Sarah Lincoln, his sister, and she goes to school with them. And then the point of the story is she, at the end, gives Lincoln this hat. And when he puts it on, she comes back to the present. And she is transformed to now be interested in learning and reading and going to school. And the whole book is rooted in all of my years of historical research. So a lot of the quotes are true to the historical record, massaged a little bit to make them work for a children's audience. There are dozens of stories that come out throughout the course of the book that are true to Lincoln's past. What I like to tell people is everything about the book is historically accurate except for the time travel part. But everything that happens to this girl, Lucy, in the story, she's learning about Lincoln's life, and it's pointing forward to his presidency. And I thought it's a way to give kids the vegetables without them knowing. They're getting the history, but it's in an adventure, fantasy, historical fiction. And my hope is that, parents and grandparents and teachers will want to give it to their kids and grandkids and nephews and nieces and students. And in fact, I've written a 16-page guide for teachers that equips them. It gives them the history behind each chapter. And then it also gives them primary sources, so that you want to know about Lincoln's love of the American Revolution. here's a speech he gave at the New Jersey Senate in February of 1861, where he talked about admiring and thinking about George Washington.
Wow.
And so teachers can have their kids read this and then give them the primary source, and they can talk about, what did the Revolution mean to Abraham Lincoln? Why did he need to fight for the Union? And so it's a really fun book. I got a Christopher Newport University student to illustrate it. So she did all the drawings. And we have a publisher in St. Louis, Reedy Press, is publishing it on February 1st. And I'm really excited about it. Reedy loved it so much that they want us to do 2 more books. So book 2 I've already written. And the same character goes to the White House in 1861. And when she encounters Lincoln, he looks at her and he can tell he has met her somewhere in the past, but he can't put his finger on it because he's aged 40 years and she's aged 6 months. So it's been a lot of fun to sort of have different mental muscles exercised in the course of writing.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Yeah. To go from the dryness of academia to the exuberance of imagination of a child is incredible, I'm sure, for you. And I sincerely hope that teachers and parents alike adopt this book or this series of books, because we're entering into an age, if we're not in it already, when much of our heroic past is being either undone or rewritten, and a lot of our heroes are being maligned. So hopefully this kind of re-pedestalizes them in the image of our youth and creates at a younger age and fosters an affinity toward these great men and women whom we should all adore. So of course I will include a link to that. I'm greatly looking forward to its publication. You can visit Reedy's website, I think, at this point and pre-order it. Mm-hmm. We're right up at our hour. So, so you've been extraordinarily generous with your time. There are so many other topics into which I'd want to delve. But again, I will encourage everyone warmly to check out Shipwrecked by John White and all of his other works. They're all available on Amazon or at your local bookstores, at your libraries, if you want to get a sample and then purchase it later. And I just extend to you, Jon, my deepest gratitude. I thank you so much for joining me and writing these books and expanding my horizons. I learned kind of inadvertently a little bit about Lincoln. Like you said, there's always something new to learn. I learned about his approach toward those piracy laws and the way in which he conducted the issue of political prisoners in that age just prior to the Civil War. So I thank you for that. And to my friends and fellow voyagers, I fare thee not only well, but forward. I'm Daniel Finneran. This is Finneran's Wake. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.